What do you think of the Derrick Rose? What do you think of when you heard that Derrick Rose dropped 50 last night?
Yeah, it's funny because I did not have that game on, so it was one of those things where I had, Twitter was giving the constant updates at just expressing the surprise, elation, everything else that you saw just kind of coming out of the ether as people saw this. I think my first thought is simply that, it's a lesson that we can't write guys off too soon. And then, listen, this is not soon, right? Like, there were many, many years where Derrick Rose did not look like Derrick Rose anymore. And I think if you concluded, as many teams did, by the way, that the best of Derrick Rose was already behind him, there was ample evidence to back that up. And so to see a throwback performance like that, I mean, I think, you have to have the reality check in mind, which is that if he was still capable of doing all this, where was it during that weird season with the Knicks? Where was it during his brief stay with the Cavs? What did the Utah Jazz not see that they decided to cut him when they traded for him January, February? They didn't even want him. They did it for, cap purposes, and then immediately waived him, and that's when he ended up going to Minnesota. There wasn't a ton of interest in him, and he signed for a minimum deal. And it's a culmination of a lot of things, but not least of which is that Derrick Rose didn't look like he was ever going to be that guy again. So to see it last night, if you're a Derrick Rose fan, if you loved him with the Bulls, and it's nice to see that. A lot has happened since then, both on and off the court, that we don't necessarily need to get into in this discussion. But I understand people being happy to see that version of Rose appear again. We'll see if that's sustainable or if that was just, a one-night throwback.
What do you think was going through his mind when he was crying at the end of that performance last night?
I have to believe that was more than anything just the joy of being that player again. When you're the youngest MVP in NBA history, which he was back in 2011. Mm-hmm. Think that the world is at your fingertips at that point. That this is just the beginning. They went toe to toe, the Bulls, with LeBron's Heat, and it looked like they were going to be the biggest rivals to the Miami Heat during that era, and it didn't happen. And part of it was Derrick Rose falling apart, and then other guys physically falling apart, and that Bulls team just crumbled. And Derrick Rose was just kind of, lost in the wilderness at that point. He was never able to quite get it back. Jimmy Butler emerged as the bigger star for Chicago. And, the athlete never believes. They're always the last one to believe that they're done, right? Or that their best days are behind them, that they can't be the superstar anymore. And everybody else had, I think, understandably decided that Derrick Rose wasn't that guy anymore. You got to think that Derrick Rose, in his mind, still believed that he could get back to that level. And I think to do it last night, that the tears at the end is probably just that, that belief had a payoff, that it's still there.
Well, after the performance leaked out to here to Los Angeles, Howard Beck of Bleacher Report here on the Rich Eisen Show, LeBron called him a superhero. And we saw the reaction from his teammates, and we also saw on NBA Twitter, the must-follow on Twitter, that what the players think of him. Has this been brewing for a long time, and just we didn't hear about the way that players felt about Derrick Rose because of, I guess, his journey that you've just mentioned?
No, I think the players have always been pretty supportive of and just generally felt, empathy for Derrick Rose because of everything he went through physically, because of the knee surgeries, because, listen, stars appreciate the other stars, and the players always appreciate the elite talents. And so to see a guy who was still so young in his career have that taken from him because of the knee problems, look, a lot of guys in this league too, sort of came up on him, right? Like, he's been around long enough that a lot of the players in the league were watching him as junior high or high school kids. So there's a reverence there and a respect for him and what he had accomplished. And so I think that's where a lot of that outpouring of support stems from.
If this was the NFL and we would be completely knee-jerk overreacting after a big performance like this, we would say that Derrick Rose is the guy who's going to glue this team together as Jimmy Butler was ripping it apart. What do you say about that as we're learning about Jimmy Butler apparently coming up with a 6-week plan to get out of Minnesota, Howard?
Yeah, which was immediately disputed. There's conflicting reports, as we call it, on that subject or that interpretation of Jimmy Butler's night off. Look, I mean, I don't think anybody disagrees. Maybe Tom Thibodeau does, but I think most people believe that eventually Jimmy Butler's going to be somewhere else. Sooner than later, he's going to get traded because he's not going to resign, and they can't take the chance of keeping him and having him walk for nothing next summer. So that's inevitable. The other part of that, who leads the team in his absence? Is it Karl Anthony Towns? Is it Derrick Rose? Is it somebody that they get back in the Jimmy Butler trade? Unlikely. That's the interesting part. But I don't think that, anybody in the NBA would look at what Derrick Rose did last night and say, well, there you go. You've got your Jimmy Butler replacement. Go ahead and trade him. You'll be fine. One game it does not erase all of the, many strange turns that have gone on with Derrick Rose over the last few years, again, both on and off the court. So I don't think if you're a franchise, you're relying on the idea that he has somehow regained his star powers at this stage of his career after so many years of struggling. It's possible to summon that once in a while. Doing it night in and night out is what actually separates the really good players from the superstars. And so the question is, what can he continue to do with an expanded role? And I don't think we know.
The Rich Eisen Show, weekdays at noon Eastern on Audience.